Sounds good. Great. All right. Fantastic. Thanks for letting me know. So today, obviously, we're talking about how we're using AI increasingly in our CRO work. Um, we're talking about how my team are using new tools, new systems, new platforms, and crucially, we'll be asking about where AI actually earns its place in a CRO workflow rather than just being a kind of shiny new tool um, that we try and incorporate somehow. We're going to try and keep hype and overexcitement and those sorts of things to a minimum, but we'll also point out the real ways that our work's getting better and more exciting and more powerful using these interesting new gadgets. Going to walk you through some of the real tools, real workflows, things we've actually shipped, and the degree to which it was all worth it or otherwise. And I'll also show off some of the new shiny stuff that we're really excited about that's going to lead to richer, more interesting online experiences for users, hopefully. There'll be questions at the end, and I'll do my best to answer them. So anything occurs to you, pop it in the chat, and we'll get to it in just a moment. So quick roadmap so you know what we'll cover. First, we'll be looking at how AI tools are helping us to uncover new optimization opportunities more quickly, but also at a scale that we haven't previously been able to achieve. Secondly, we'll be looking at the amazing things that our analytics team and our data team are building that mean that insights, numbers, analytics are accessible to everybody in our agency, regardless of SQL knowledge or that kind of technical expertise. The third thing that we'll be looking at is meta-analysis. So we've run hundreds of tests this year, hundreds more last year. We need a way to learn from all of them, aggregate all of that information and insight, and turn it into something useful. And then finally, the really exciting stuff, we'll be looking at how we're building new experiences around generative AI. So rather than just using AI to analyze a website, this is how AI becomes part of the online experience. So, section one, finding opportunities. Now, the traditional way of identifying optimization opportunities is a fairly laborious process. So, you create a model of user behavior by combining a lot of analytics data with some qualitative insights. You're going to look at how people move through a website, try and combine that with what you know about the customer journey. You'd refine that again with some qualitative analysis, which can be quite a heavy investment of time and effort, not to mention money. You need to bear in mind your users' motivations, all of these separate data streams. And you apply all of that to your key journeys and then augment that with something like a heuristic review that picks out the UX flaws and obstacles based on established design principles. You're aggregating a huge amount of information, covering a lot of territory, and you're using all of your experience and mental effort to isolate meaningful observations. And that's incredibly valuable work. In some ways, it's the center of everything that we do, but it's also incredibly slow, quite technical, and there are other drawbacks too. So it's not an easily standardized process. There's a degree of subjectivity involved. And whilst it's really powerful at a zoomed in scale, when you start to widen the scope and look at something the size of a website, it can be a little bit overwhelming. So if there were useful AI tools that would help us with that, it would obviously be tremendously welcome. So the first of those problems that we've tried to solve with our AI tools is the problem of scale. Now, when it comes to understanding aspects of a website that need work, human specialists are obviously excellent at close-up, narrowly defined journeys, but the site-wide trends are a real challenge. We've built a series of tools that crawl a website, using quantitative data as the context and analyze it according to a vast rubric of yes and no questions, which is based on our dimensions framework. We've done webinars on our dimensions framework previously, so I won't go into that in depth, but um, if you have questions, feel free to ask about it. What you get at the end is what you see in the bottom right here. It's a different kind of output to what you'd get with a human review. It's much more zoomed out and it's much more at a site-wide scale. We're basically able to score a website or a section of a website against each of the 7 dimensions in our framework. And that allows us to approach the UX review side of our work with much more accuracy, much more precision, without necessarily tackling each page with the same level of focus. Because the output is detailed and systematic, it means that we can be slightly more objective in our analysis. But it also means that we're able to review the way that the tools have scored a website or a part of a website and make sure that we agree with the analysis and the assessment as well. So it's got that really key combination of solving a problem, being something that we can easily verify, and enhancing our capabilities in a real way. So the next thing that we needed help with was that mechanism that takes all of that context, huge amount of context that you get with expert agency guidelines. So things like legal regulations or best practice guidance, where you've got typically a document of 500 to 1,000 pages. And as web developers, as optimization specialists, we're required to apply that to a website word for word. And if you miss even a small thing, it can be really, really consequential. What we've done essentially is we've built a tool that can absorb, understand, analyze all of those regulations, that whole best practice guide, and apply it in one go to a website in a way that surfaces really valuable information for us. Essentially, we're trying to get around the drawback of human memory and attention to apply the same sort of analysis that regulation specialists expect us to. Um, there are 2 examples on screen of how these sorts of tools work for us. So one of them is built around the FCA guidance for insurance brokers. We work with a lot of insurance journeys, and the compliance lens is quite important to whether or not our ideas ever make it into code. So having a tool that can look at the published online guidance about what insurers are required to adhere to online, give us that first impression about whether or not a design is going to be compliant is really, really valuable. That takes a little bit of work away from the bottleneck in a lot of insurance development workflows, which is checking with someone that knows those requirements. The other example here is built around accessibility guidelines. Um, so it's the W3 schools, WCAG guidelines, which are long, dense, sometimes impenetrable. Most of us know the basics of accessibility, so things like alt text, contrast ratios, and stuff like that. But there's just a fantastic amount of detail and scale that it's not necessarily practical to fully absorb and apply as specialists. Um, so this allows us to get an accessibility lens without reading that guideline cover to cover, which is really, really valuable. Cool. And finally, the third reference tool that we've built that assists us in finding optimization opportunities is this hypothesis scraper, or it's actually a series of different hypothesis scrapers. So there are times when it's useful to augment some of that more serious, thoughtful, considered analysis with a sense of what other people have done in similar circumstances. When people have had real success optimizing a journey that's similar to the one that you're looking at the time. The advantage in that scenario is that when people in this area achieve success, they tend to be pretty obliging about sharing their success, showing off. And what our hypothesis scraper does is it produces a seemingly endless number of plausible ideas, drawing from published case studies for A/B testing tools, CRO specialists, CRO agencies, in-house blogs, and things like that. It'll generate a long list for you that searches all of these published resources and identifies interesting concepts that you can think about applying. It's not necessarily something that you apply one to one, but it quite often trigger a new idea, a new thought, or help center you when you've gone too far down one direction and you need to have a bit of a reset. It's not necessarily that good at the rapier thrust, insight, re-engineering type optimization. But most CRO roadmaps combine those strategic direction setters with something a little bit more tactical every now and then. And this is really great at giving you a lot of options. So there's three little tools that demonstrate how we can use fairly easy, quick, custom GPTs or Claude projects or agents just to augment what we're able to achieve. And in most cases, expanding the limitations that we have as humans so that we can apply a wider range of information and apply it to a wider number of pages. In this next section, I'm going to share a very exciting tool that our team have built, and that is to do with making data a little bit more accessible. So everything that we do in this industry is based on analytics to some extent. But the problem is that there's always a barrier or an obstacle between a specialist and the data in some way. So if you use J4, it's great, but you have to accept that there's a specific data structure and the reporting has a lot of arbitrary limits. You don't always get to pick the questions that you ask because it's built around dashboards. And then if you try and create your own Explore report that's a little bit more custom, there are going to be limitations in terms of the look back period, in terms of the scope of the different dimensions and metrics that you apply. And then they'll delete your data at some point anyway. So there are a lot of drawbacks there. A data warehouse seems like a solution, but then you have another problem, which is the interface, because if everything that you do is mediated through SQL, it's going to be slow and you're going to need an expert there. So there's always a bottleneck. So here's our solution, roughly. You export your analytics into a proper data warehouse. So now everything's queryable with SQL. You've got big data sets, really, really useful. Still got that obstacle, which is how many people in your team know SQL, but equally, even if they do, is that really how you want to query your data on a day-to-day basis? Well, having a large language model layer between the specialist and the data warehouse is actually an immediate shortcut. So we've built a tool that has that applied. You can choose different large language models to use. It just means that anyone in your team can type a question in plain English and get an answer pulled straight away from the data. So that's exciting, but there's another step which is probably even more transformative, which is that you can add agent functionality on top of that. And that means that you can export all of your data into a warehouse and then create something that has automated reporting workflows, alerts. You can create customized dashboards. You can set your own schedules, and you can do all of that just using plain English. So instead of ask a question, wait, get an answer. Someone sends another question off to the one person in your team that has the skills. As soon as you have a question that needs answering, you can ask this tool that question, and it will give you an answer in the language that you use. It's a way of genuinely democratizing data, and you're no longer gatekept by technical skills or by the limitations of a platform. And this is what it looks like in practice. So it's a natural language question in, and immediately you get a proper chart and some numbers out in the format that you ask for. If you ask for a table, it'll give you a table. If you ask for a graph, it'll give you a graph. No SQL required from the person asking. Really, really valuable. You can also ask for calculated metrics, all of those sorts of things. The maths uh, capability is really, really strong. So, for example, if you're looking for an interquartile range, that can be something that's really laborious and annoying to do in an analytics platform because you have to export everything and then apply that average separately. This will do that for you, and as I say, you get your answer very, very quickly, and you don't necessarily need to have any of the same technical skills or specialist skills that you'd need previously. The normal rules do apply to this. So it's, garbage in, garbage out. Data hygiene is really, really important. You still need someone to engineer the framework, and you need to pay attention to how your data is collected, your data structure, all of those sorts of things. But once you've got this tool in place, suddenly the most important and valuable thing that your web team have access to, which is your data, is available to absolutely everyone on the team, which is exciting. So section 3, meta-analysis, is how we make sense of the bigger picture. So every single test teaches you something, but most agencies and most teams are not very good at actually using what test 12 taught them by the time they get to test 74, let alone test 300. And it just sits in a folder somewhere. It's very difficult to actually apply the insights that running hundreds of tests give you. That's a real shame because it's a fairly rare, fairly valuable insight. Um, and you'll tend to develop your own biases and your own assumptions over time about what a sequence of tests is telling you without really interrogating that idea with anything like real data. Now, we've got an archive of hundreds of A/B tests, and unless you use it, an archive is just a graveyard. But if you put an interface on top of it, which is what you can see here, it's basically a chat interface, it means that you can ask things like, what category of tests historically performs best on pricing page, or here we've got what are some interesting kinds of tests for which industries. Probably ask something a bit more specific in practice, but you get the general idea. Now, a human strategist can't hold 200 tests worth of nuance in their head at once and reliably spot the underlying patterns. But this tool will apply whatever kind of analysis you need to 100 different tests in dozens of different ways whenever you need it. And it basically activates this reservoir of information that we've had for almost a decade without being able to activate in a really practical way. We've spoken about how we use our test archive in another webinar, so I won't linger on it now. But it's worth saying that this has unlocked some really, really powerful insights for us. It helps us qualify new ideas. It's driving our strategy in a lot of cases. So it's a really, really important asset for any CRO team, any CRO program. Great. So section 4, and this is where we shift gears a little bit. Everything so far has been how AI helps us to do CRO better behind the scenes, but this last section is about how AI tools and AI platforms are actually becoming part of the customer-facing experience itself. So the first example of that I'll draw your attention to are this new generation of guided selling tools. If you've ever built a product finder, anything like that, you'll know what it's like. Answer four questions, we'll recommend the right product. It can be a pretty clunky and prescriptive process. It works fine, but it's limited and it can only handle paths that someone's thought to design in advance. An AI powered version of that can actually hold the conversation, can tailor its answers to a specific circumstance, to the requirements that you have as a business, but equally to the context that it gets from customers. It unlocks a level of product discovery that has not been possible for e-commerce and retail websites in the past, and it has the potential, I think, to rework the customer journey that a lot of the e-commerce industry is built on. So someone can say something messy, inhuman, and obscure, like I need a bag for weekend trips, but it also needs to work in the office, something like that. And instead of forcing them down a decision tree, or instead of trying to get them to work through a menu structure that can be a little bit um, restrictive, the assistant can ask a sensible follow-up, narrow things down further, or just surface the most relevant products for that person, provide them with a link to the product page, even summarize why they've selected those products as particularly relevant. It's a genuinely different category of experience from a traditional guided selling process. Um, and it's very exciting for a very specific type of business. So there's lots of industries and there's lots of businesses where product discovery is the defining obstacle. If there's a shopping experience where a user would prefer to do it in person, usually, that's a pretty good indication that this kind of tool is going to unlock a section of sales that you can now bring online that previously would have had to have taken place offline. Um, so, for example, if you have a website where a user might ask which part of the ship is best for seasickness, or how many bottles of this do I need for a party, or can you show me cars that have a manual gearbox, air conditioning, and lots of boot space? Those sorts of requirements that actually tend to shape people's decisions, but that you don't necessarily render on a web page because they're very specific. Suddenly, we can service that at very little cost and effort. So this is really exciting. We're experimenting with a few of these different solutions, um, how to apply them best. And one thing that it is really useful for is as an alternative to a site search component. Site search is really important for us as website optimization specialists because it gives us an idea about the questions that people are asking, where the gaps are in web content, the language that people are using, and things like that. This takes that to another level because we're not just getting the initial question from a user and they're not going to use it in the same way as they'd use a search engine, focusing on keywords and things like that, trying to anticipate the actual engine. This is a much more intimate and detailed insight into how people are thinking, how your customers are thinking. And it can ask follow-up questions that gather extra details. So the analytics that you'll get from this again are going to be much more valuable than they've ever been previously. So product discovery is a problem that we've come up against a lot, but there's another one which is fairly intriguing from a behavioral perspective, and that's the degree to which social context has to be either broad and generic or highly curated and therefore slightly more questionable from a customer point of view. And we all know that reviews and ratings are hugely powerful, but there is a catch, which is that they have to be representative and they have to be objective, or they end up damaging trust rather than building it. So there's an obstacle there, which is how can you make sure a customer on your page that sells headphones is seeing reviews that are relevant to someone interested in headphones? If someone's on your delivery details page, how do you show them reviews that are specific to how great your delivery system is without actually manually curating the list and therefore rendering the content null and void because it's no longer objective? Well, what we did was we built a dynamic review component, implemented it on a client site, This surfaces really highly relevant reviews automatically without curation for quality. So there's no manual curation sitting there cherry picking quotes. It's matching relevant representative reviews to the specific product or context someone's looking at. And it's doing that live dynamically and updating as reviews are introduced. And the great thing for that is that there's always been a little bit of squeamishness and anxiety about true user generated content and review content, obviously, because it's the shop front to your business, to your brand reputation. There's a certain risk with allowing content to appear that isn't carefully curated. But now we have tools that are able to apply the sorts of judgment that you might make naturally and manually at scale automatically. You can take yourself out of that curation process, and you can give people a much more dynamic, organic, exciting experience. Um, Again, at very little cost and effort. When we implemented this, it had an immediate impact. The 4% increase in new business leads, which was fairly transformative for our client, really, really valuable, and an additional 2.7 million in incremental revenue. So not just an improvement in customer experience, not just something that makes the shopping journey much more accurate and precise, something with a real business impact that's relatively easy and quick to engineer. So very grateful to large language models for that. And then we have the frontier bit. So this is where a lot of us are still trying to figure out the playbook rather than necessarily already having settled workflows like the one I showed you earlier. Um, Increasingly, augmented reality tools are allowing e-commerce websites and retail websites to bring some of that in-person shopping experience into the online user journey. A couple of really interesting examples here. So Specsavers have this automatic glasses try on that means that you can do a little bit of product discovery from home. Maybe that means that you go into the shop with already a sense of the sorts of things that you'd be interested in, what might suit you, what might not suit you. It expands immediately the range of products that you're able to search beyond what Specsavers could have on a wall of the shop to a warehouse of potentially millions of options. But it also means that there's a potential for you to not go in to the shop and to buy glasses on the basis of something that gives you a sense of what they're going to look like. As long as there's a good returns policy in process or there's some kind of mechanism that makes that plausible, I can really see how you'd get customer journeys that used to always involve in-person visits taking place entirely online. Another example of that would be home renovations, where perhaps you'd be interested in booking for a specialist to come and design something up for your house, but you're not totally sure whether it's suitable for your house. Um, so you kind of want to see a mock-up first to make sure that you're not wasting someone's time. Uh, a virtual designer where you can upload a photo of your whatever part of your house you're interested in renovating that would then give you an impression of what might be done to that would be a really valuable way to unlock a huge section of business where people are just a little bit squeamish or struggling to make that first step. And then there's this other example, which is from Maybelline. So this is a virtual try on makeup tool, which is a lot of fun. Give it a go. Honestly, it's really exciting and interesting. Um, And this is something where, again, it is partly bringing customer experience that used to have to be completely in person into the online user experience, but it's also potentially enriching the customer experience with lots of different ideas, introducing people to different kinds of products, and also just a little bit of fun, a little bit of a flagship experience. So this is a pretty good example of something that is a really exciting application of AI, but where quality is really important. it's something that only really works in a positive way if the underlying tech and the underlying product are both very, very good. It's a category where good enough AI can backfire pretty quickly. It doesn't take too many people buying the wrong type of glasses because the virtual try-on tool isn't really up to scratch before the whole thing starts to become more of a problem than it is a solution. Um, and it's worth remembering that although these kinds of tools are proliferating, some of them are not very good. And so that's going to be a problem. Quality control is really important, but the promise for future implementations is enormous. And certainly, as part of an experimentation roadmap, incorporating this kind of strategic shift is going to be really, really valuable moving forwards. So that's just a quick overview of some of the ways that we're incorporating AI into our work. Obviously, I haven't been able to go into full detail in all of these different areas because some of it we have to be slightly more um, selective with what we communicate and share. But I hope that gives a general idea of all of the exciting ways that we're trying to incorporate these tools and these platforms. I have a suspicion that although we feel like we're making a lot of progress quite quickly, there's still a lot of progress and a lot of exciting things that we can do that we haven't explored yet. So I'd be really interested in any ideas, suggestions, recommendations, or questions that you've got that are related to how perhaps you're using AI to optimize your website. Or if you've seen anything that's interesting and you'd just like to get our sense of whether or not we think it'd be appropriate, please give us a message. Um, any questions, add them to the chat. I can see a couple of questions now. Just going to take a quick pause and then I'll see if I can answer those. Okay, so there's a question here about a little bit more detail about the repository approach to testing. So that's the example that we talked about where we have an archive of tests, hundreds and hundreds of tests in our case. And what we want to use AI to do is to isolate patterns about what's worked where and therefore what might work in the future, but equally to give a new lens on the customer experience as a whole. There are a lot of different online options for repositories, uh, knowledge hubs, those sorts of things that will allow you to tabulate your test results. And usually you can bulk upload from a spreadsheet tests that you've done previously. I think the first step probably is to make sure that your records for testing that you've done previously are complete and that you have a data structure that you're happy with. So what are all the different aspects of each test that you'd like to use to compare and find useful patterns? Once you've done that, there are loads of free tools. So, for example, Airtable has a free plan and it's pretty good. You can upload the tests that you've done so far into that, formulate them however you like, and then start to either export that and use a language model of your choice separately. But Airtable in particular has incorporated a lot of AI functionality into the platform so you can query the data in your repository directly from that platform. You can ask for insights about a particular industry, for example. Really, really valuable. Getting started is, to a certain extent, the hardest part. And when we first started the process, it was a long um, slog, the hard yards, lots of data entry and those sorts of things. Um, but worth it in the end. Cool. So let's see the Q&A. So question here. In terms of the heuristic review and the scoring, do you have examples of the AI prompts you created in order to get all the scores across those categories? Yes, I can share that information. So we approached this in a couple of ways, and one way was not that effective, and one way turned out to be quite effective. So the first thing that we did, I think, is the most intuitive approach to this, which is to upload a lot of our proprietary research, a lot of the original resources that we use to guide our dimensions framework. So research in behavioral science, psychology, user experience design, and stuff like that. Upload that all into a tool and then ask it to grade a website according to a set of dimensions that we define. We found that that was not very effective. And in hindsight, there's an obvious drawback there, which is that you're asking the tool to do something that you can't then verify, particularly. It's quite difficult to know how it's applied the information that it's absorbed and understood. And in any case, if it was to just make up a score, there'd be no way to make sure that it was based on something rational and coherent. So what we've done subsequently is to build out a question set that is, I think, close to 1,000 questions, individual questions, most of them yes/no questions, and with a certain degree of flexibility about how they're applied, but that build on what we have created in our dimensions framework so that something like the limits of a human brain, which is one aspect of our framework, can be used to interrogate a website in a systematic and repeatable way. And because we've got that question set, we can see the answers in a tabular form, look through the scores that have been applied in that area and double check it. Sorts of questions that we might have in that area would be it might be a mathematical question, so it might be to do with how many primary categories navigation architecture has compared to the number of secondary categories. It might be about the number of different open journeys that a user is experiencing when they first land. It might be something to do with word count or um, readability scores, those sorts of things, where it's a quantitative value that, of course, on its own is not going to tell you that much, but if you combine it with some other considerations, it can give you a general idea. Crucially, one step that we had to go through when we were building this tool is how do you then take the scores that a particular website has achieved, but make it relevant for what that website does? So there are some industries where the product is really complicated and difficult, and so it's always going to score relatively low for something like clarity. Um, so our tool has an additional step, which is to benchmark two or three competitor websites at the same time, and then take the differences between the scores it's got in each question. And that's a ludicrous amount of computation for a human to do. You'd never design a process that way because it would be too time consuming and what you'd get out of it would be not necessarily worth it. But because it's automatic, it is worth it. And it gives us a much more accurate snapshot of how a website's comparing to its immediate competitors. I hope that's relatively uh, useful and clear as an overview. If you've got more questions on that, it's something that we'd love to talk about. So get in touch and you can email the address here, cro@freshegg.com. We'll give you some more in-depth answers. Here we are, keen to understand how you move from an existing Excel repository into an AI interface. So if you've got an AI tool, like a large language model, Claude, ChatGPT, any of them, you can upload your database's context into a custom project or a custom GPT, and then you can do your analysis like that. It's a fairly clunky way to do it, or you can use just an online database type tool. So if it's Excel, you could, for example, move it into Google Sheets and then use something like Copilot built on top of that. Um, or you could just create a little workflow that takes the information from your Google Sheets and queries it using a language model. Probably the easiest solution is to look at something like Airtable where it's all built in. There are lots of other options. Hey Marvin is good, for example. If you want to include not just test information, but if you want to include user research and things like that. There's also a tool called Condense, which is probably more suited to a repository that's based on user research and video information because it will do your transcription and stuff like that for you as well. So if you're a relatively lean team, you should probably go for one of those online solutions that combines all of the different steps um, with the AI functionality built in. I'd say start with Airtable. If it's not, if it doesn't have the functionality that you want, then look for some alternatives. Um, and again, that's something that we'd be interested in discussing. So if you have any more questions, get in touch and let us know. So, um, got three resources here that are from our website or webinars that we've previously done. So you can see an overview of the dimensions framework here on our site. You can download that. That's how we've built our audit tool. It's how we analyze websites when we do a manual UX audit or a heuristic review. Generally, a pretty interesting rubric for understanding user experience, but also for categorizing and understanding tests that you've run. So give that a go. And if you're interested, if you have any questions about that, let us know. We've also got this webinar that we've run previously about how we've built our test repository and how we've applied it. So any more detail on that, you can watch that video and read that post. Equally, got a little bit more information here about how we created our data warehouse and the data warehouse query system that allows anyone on your team to ask your data questions as though they were talking to a specialist with all of the skills required to query and analyze your valuable data. So if there aren't any more questions, I think that's everything. Thank you for your time. And any more questions or anything like that, give us an email. We'd be happy to let you know what we think. Thanks very much.